Okay, folks, I think we will make a start. So welcome to the 6th in the series of our OCRC Relaunch. This evening, we're doing something slightly different. So whereas previously we've had people sort of giving sort of scholarly papers, on this occasion, it will be a conversation between myself and the Revd Dr Rob Ellis, who is the principal of Regent's Park College. And so Rob and I have a series of questions that we'll ask each other. The title of our conversation is Talking Sport, Religion and Race. Explorations into the interface on how we conceive human identity, belonging and meaning in Britain. All that to say, it's just an excuse like for two people who love sport and are religious like to talk about our existing passions. So what we're going to do is that we're going to have a conversation for the next 45, 50 minutes or so. And then after that, if any of you are still awake, then you will be invited to offer some questions to each of us, to both of us, offer your insights into what you have heard us share about our respective passions. Both Rob and I have both written about religion and sport in the past. And I've been kind of looking forward to this because we've had bits of conversations, usually sort of prior to meetings or maybe just after meetings, where we haven't really sort of gone into as much depth about how important these respective things are in our lives. And so I've really been looking forward to this as an opportunity to share our existing passions and also, I think, to make the connections in terms of religion and culture. And so, as I said, so in our conversation, it'll be a series of questions in the sort of classic Socratic manner. So we'll throw questions at each other, hopefully not to bamboozle or to catch each other out, but just really opportunities for clarification and further reflection. And as I said, and at the end of it, then we'll have our normal Q&A, and please feel free to chip in. Hopefully you are still awake, but you should be, because this will be an entertaining conversation, I hope. So we'll kick off. So Rob, what's your earliest sporting memory or recollection, and why do you think that is important, I guess, for you and important in general?
Yes, thanks, Anthony, and hello, everyone. Well, many people that one talks to in the Christian community can tell you the date of their conversion, especially in evangelical circles. I can't do that, I'm afraid. I can tell you the day that I became converted, if that's the right word, to sport. It was the 21st of December, 1963. It was at some point during the afternoon of that Saturday, as I sat in the small living room of the police house in which my family lived at the time in Cardiff, South Wales. And I watched Wales on the small black and white TV in the corner of the room lose by 6 points to 0 to New Zealand. I'd been dimly aware of the New Zealanders on tour in South Wales. Incidentally, I was 7 at this point. My mum's hairdresser, who came to the house in those days, had a boyfriend who played for the Newport team that had beaten the All Blacks, the only team to beat them on that tour earlier in the autumn. They'd beaten Cardiff 6-5 a few weeks before, and I can remember my dad being animated about that. And then I watched the game, and immediately after it, I replayed it endlessly in our hallway, in our garden. I immediately caught sport, and sport has this power, which some of you will know, to captivate and enthrall and inflame and control and channel something or other. And theologians will know something about eschatology. I am still waiting at the age of 64 for Wales to beat New Zealand. I'm still very angry about the way in which New Zealand won in 1978 with a cheating manoeuvre in the last minute. Sport, like religion, offers the rare opportunity to nurture a grievance. And I've nurtured it for all this time since 1978. Some of you will have done something similar. So Anthony, what about you? What's your earliest sporting recollection and why important?
Yeah, so for me, it's August 1973, and it's the West Indies. I tour in England, and in August, after the Test series, like they only played 3 tests that year, was the first ever international. It was the first ever one-day international between the West Indies and England, and my dad got tickets. I was 8 years old, and he took me with him. So all I remember was getting up very early in the morning, and my mum sort of packed a lunch for us. And we then got the bus into the city centre, and then we met my dad's 4 brother-in-laws. Like my dad has 4 sisters, and so we met my uncle Enel, my uncle George, my uncle Lawrence, and Uncle Willie. And then we got the train to Leeds, which is about 25 minutes or so, and then we arrived at the ground. I have to say, I'll be honest with you, I can't remember anything about the game. I'm told that England won narrowly. By modern standards, in terms of one-day cricket, it was pretty poor fare. The 2 things I remember is, one is how personally cold it was. So as I said a bit earlier, it was summer in theory, and I had worn a layer 2 less, and I'd spent the whole day moaning about how cold it was. And my dad was sort of saying repeatedly, if I'd have known that you were going to moan, I'd have left you at home, boy. Anyway, so I was just moaning. But what I really remember of the day was this sense of camaraderie amongst all these Caribbean people. I'd never seen so many black people in one place at that point in my life. But although there was carnival in Leeds, like we were not a carnival family, like my mum was much too Christian like to let us go to anything ungodly as carnival. So like we never did carnival. However, so this was the equivalent of being amongst a large number of Caribbean migrants. And the thing that struck me most significantly was how happy my dad was. Because most of my life when I was growing up, he was a bit of a miserable bugger, to be honest with you, which I've told him several times since. Which, in fairness, he had a lot to be miserable about. I mean, he had a job he hated. He never really came to terms with living in the UK. I mean, like, he's been retired back in Jamaica now for 29 years. And so for a lot of time, I guess like a lot of frustrated working class men, he took out his frustrations on his family. I mean, he was never particularly violent, but he was not particularly the most, I guess, like touchy-feely of men, which is probably not unusual really for that generation anyway. But all I remember was that he was just happy. He was just exuberant. And at one point, I think someone had taken a wicket, and he turned to me, grabbed me and kissed me. And I remember just being shocked, thinking, basically, has some zombie taken over my father here? Because this is not a man I recognize in this particular moment. And one of the things I have to say was that at that moment, he was far happier than he ever was in church, actually listening to sermons and singing hymns. So I think what I took from that was this sense of belonging, being part of something bigger. And again, I guess, you know, I mean, we talk about eschatology in religion. What we also sometimes talk about is transcendence, that sense of being in a place, but there's something about the moment that takes you beyond it. So at that moment, we were not just in city centre Leeds freezing our ass off, although we were certainly doing that. It was something more about, this was like the Caribbean diaspora, and this was my induction into it. I mean, I was probably one of only a small number of young boys there. It was very much an adult male thing. I mean, I don't remember many women being there. And I don't remember my dad even asking my mum if she wanted to come. It was just assumed that this was like the men's day out. And this was my kind of induction into the world of adult Caribbean men. the language was very saucy. Let's just put it that way, and got increasingly so the more alcohol that was sort of consumed as the day went on. And that moment has stuck in my life ever since. I think I became a devotee of West Indies cricket from that particular moment.
Okay, I'm glad you put the last line in, because I was just about to say that presumably you were pleased that England won, but I think you've cleared that up now, so that
no,
we don't need.
Not pleased that England won. I mean, although I didn't really understand that England had won, because like I said, I was only 8 years old, but I've always been a supporter of the West Indies cricket team. Yeah. Ever since.
So what I mean, in the way that you described the title for our conversation, what do you see then as some of the connections between sport and religion and race?
Yeah. I think at its best, and also I think at its worst, I think that there is a sort of downside, or maybe a more corrosive side to this, is I think it connotes sort of sense of belonging. I think there's a kind of boundedness in terms of who's in and kind of who's out. So I think all of us are kind of tribal, if we're honest. I think human nature is, I think we tend to gravitate to people who share our outlooks, our worldviews. And so for me, I think that one of the things I was very clear about, certainly growing up in Bradford, was I belonged to at least two quintessential tribes. One was, I think, sort of chapel Christianity, particularly sort of chapel Methodism, which was very much located with allegiance to like the Labour Party, trade unions. Like my dad was actually trade unionist. Anthony, as in my first name, I'm named after Tony Benn. So that's what tells like my dad's politics, basically. And so sport, and I think particularly, well, two passions of my life at the time would have been the West Indies and Leeds United. So West Indies, I think that brought the sense of transcendence and joy. Leeds United just brought pure misery and unhappiness, because like they had a wonderful propensity for losing on a regular basis when they should win. And I think that taught me like the misery, I think, of that sort of sense of sort of collective identity. So I think things about collective identity, that bounded sense of being part of an in-group and defining yourself against your enemies. And so one of the things that was very, very clear actually when I was growing up in Bradford is that whilst religion was about transcendence, that did not include people who supported Manchester United. So basically, I guess people who supported Manchester United and Anglicans, actually, like, probably in equal measure, were the two people that we disliked the most, certainly in terms of working class non-conformist Bradford. So as I said, I don't think it always brings out the best in us. I think just as religion and its tribalism has often been a source of enmity and a way of objectification of the other, I think sport does that as well. And I've grown up with all those prejudices. So even down to my adulthood, I take almost as much delight in Manchester United losing as I do in the delight in my team actually winning. Of which I'm not proud, but I own it, you know? So Rob, I guess that's the same question for you. So what do you see as the connection between sport, religion, and race, or perhaps maybe a more accurately, so ethnicity?
Okay, well, I think sport and religion have all kinds of connections. And when I tell people that I work on sport and religion, that they often initially look a bit dazed and as if I might be pulling their leg or something. And then as I begin talking about it, you can see them immediately making connections with it. So, I mean, I think sport certainly seems to function as, at least as a quasi-religion. It serves that function well, I think, because when it is said that one of the root meanings of relegare is binding together. And as you just said, Anthony, it has this remarkable ability to bind people together, both participants and those of us who participate from the touchline, if I put it that way. So I think I resist calling such people spectators. I think they are participants, but they participate in a different way. And sport also has, I think at its heart, a kind of a yearning and a reaching out. Whether we're reaching out to win or we're reaching out to be the best we can in any given moment, or to do something that's just remarkable, whether it's the single pass in football or shot in cricket or whatever it is. I think there's this moment, and I think that's, as I've argued in other places, I think that's immediately kind of connects sporting experience and religious experience in a very particular way. And I use the notion of transcendence to try and bring them together. But sports also taking on other functions of religion. I think for many people, the year is kind of mapped out for them now. Their whole experience of the passage of time is mapped out through the way they understand the sporting year to work around. And it provides a kind of coherent passion for the way they live their lives. I think the connection between sport and race is one that I speak of rather more diffidently, I think, especially with you, Anthony. But I mean, clearly sport has sometimes focused racism. If you think about the way that sport has been used by the apartheid regime, for instance, if you think of current football incidents that are being reported, there's been a great spike in reports of racist incidents in football, where just when I think the authorities thought they were making some progress, before we lost crowds in stadia, and through social media since we've lost crowds in stadia, that's reared its ugly head again. And of course, historically, if you look in the US, for instance, the segregation of baseball leagues in the latter part of the 19th century after initial mixed competitions, right through until after the Second World War, that's a very graphic illustration of how race and sport in a very negative way can collide with one another. But while that's a very graphic example, actually we can look much nearer to home in our own country to see it working. So it's said, for instance, that if we look at the stats of professional sports people, that the wages earned by people of colour are generally lower. There's a phenomenon that you may know of that's called stacking, which says certainly until very recently in many sports, the black players, for instance, were generally not in the positions of influence on the field. They were not the quarterbacks. They were whatever the equivalent in American football is to the wings. And certainly there was a study in rugby union that was done a few decades ago that showed that the proportion of black players was small. And those that were playing were almost always on the wing. They were right out on the fringes where they kind of conformed to a stereotype of being speedy, but not having to think very much. They could just run straight for the line. It's all kind of reinforcing certain very dangerous stereotypes. And then you've got the question of sometimes called the afterlife. So where are the black coaches in English football, for instance, now? When you consider the proportion of black footballers in English football, where are the coaches? They're just not there. Sometimes sport's been a site of resistance to racism. I suppose most famously the '68 Olympics, Tommy Smith and John Carlos on the Black Power salutes. Maybe you go back further, Jesse Owens in Hitler's Berlin Olympics. And of course, Smith and Carlos, Muhammad Ali, Tiger Woods, they've all in different ways found that if you say things that support the status quo, then you aren't considered to be being political. But as soon as you say things which in any way challenge the status quo, then you're not allowed to say that because that's being political. And sport and politics mustn't meet, apparently, even though, of course, this is complete fantasy. Sport and politics are inevitably bound up with one another all the time. And then just another element to all of this, participation in most sports in the UK by ethnic minority groups is lower than their white equivalent groups, especially among women. So here's another sense in which we have a connection, a negative connection between sport and race. So there's just a few thoughts to start.
Yeah, and as a very, very sort of quick addendum to that, I think the two things I remember, well, firstly growing up and now more recently, was one, was that I remember being told by a games teacher that black people couldn't swim because our bones were too heavy, which of course is utter nonsense. But like, there's a whole generation of us who actually believed it, you know. I mean, so I was convinced that like, the reason why I could not swim very, very well is because like my bones were too heavy, and clearly I was at a distinct disadvantage with my best friend, who was a fantastic swimmer. And again, and I think you're right, the way in which race and race politics has evolved kind of fed their way into what kind of sport people can do, and the sports that are more suitable to Europeans because they're more intellectual and more technical rather than the ones that have about sort of raw physicality. But I think probably my favourite story, which I think shows both, I think at one level, the kind of absurdity of some of this, as well as that sense of tribal loyalty, is about 5 years ago when I was working for the Methodist Church, I had a colleague who shall remain nameless for obvious reasons, who was looking for a house. He just got engaged, and he and his fiancée were looking for a house, and they lived in Manchester. And so his wife, well, she's now his wife, although like the relationship did sort of hit quite a bumpy patch when you hear the story. So basically, his then fiancée rings him and says, I found a place that I think is affordable. Come have a look at it. I think like we should put in a bid straight away. It's fantastic. Anyway, so the house is on Blue Moon Way, which is the location of the former Manchester City Ground main road. And he's a dyed-in-the-wool Manchester United fan. Anyway, so he turns up, gets out of the house, gets out of the car, so I haven't followed it on sat now, I've not realised where it was. Took one look at the house, seen the sign Blue Moon Way, got back in the car and drove straight up and said, no, we can't live here. She says, but why not? He says, oh, because this used to be Manchester City's ground. She says, but don't be ridiculous. It was, but it isn't anymore, and we need somewhere to live. He says, I'm sorry, but we cannot live here anyway. So like, they break up over this. Because like she thinks it's ridiculous. He's saying, but like, you can't understand, I cannot live in a house that is on enemy ground. So eventually, after about 6-7 months of bargy, they get back together again, but they buy a house in another part of the city because he cannot countenance living on Blue Moon Way. That tells you how tribal and how powerful this stuff can be in both its best sense and the worst sense of it. So Rob, so who's your earliest sporting hero? And looking back, do you see any religious or spiritual resonance as with this heroic figure?
I think probably my earliest sporting heroes would have been some of the Welsh players of the late 60s and into the 70s who would have been considered the amongst the rugby pantheon, if you like. It's interesting that word is sometimes used in this context. Barry John, of whom it used to be said that the ground where Wales play their international games and where the Cardiff club plays its games has a river, the River Taff, running along beside it. And it used to be said of Barry John that he would walk to the ground across the river. So, and you know, this is a nice indication of the way in which people borrow these biblical images and apply them to sports players and situations. And of course, you know, language like redemption is very common language in sport, one way or another. Gareth Edwards would be another one, often called now one of, if not the best player ever to play the game. Religious significance, well, both of these players played in positions that were quite pivotal for the kind of strategic way in which the game is run. Both of them showed great skill and great daring and great courage at times. But both of them were players who, like all great players in all sports, I think, appear to have more time than everybody else around them. But I struggle to find very much religious resonance beyond this curious crossover that takes place probably in Welsh rugby more than it does in some other cultural locations. And here we're to do with the fact that when I went along to watch Wales international rugby matches, it still happens now to some extent, but in a lesser way. The crowd would sing hymns before the game started, and indeed during the match. The Welsh comedian and songwriter Max Boyce used to talk about 10,000 instant Christians at the international games. And there was a kind of overlay of seriousness and sacredness about when one talked about the game. And there's a joke that Max Boyce used to tell about the crowd at the Welsh game, and how the game's in full flow, and the three friends are there together, and one of them suddenly stops and takes his hat off and holds it onto his chest. And the others look around and they see that there's a funeral cortege going up the road outside the ground. And one says to the other, that's remarkable of you to show moments of respect at a time like this with the game in full flow. And he says, well, it's the least I could do. We were married for many years. So there's this sense of the kind of overlay of these sacred concerns on top of this game, which somehow takes them on. That's curious. And of course, that's a story about rugby in one particular part of the world, but it could be told about football in another part of the world. I've got a book on my shelf behind me, written by a Liverpool football supporter, that's called Football as Religion. And he analyses life as a supporter of Liverpool FC, with each chapter a heading from the creeds. So, it is not the only place it's done. How about you? Who were your heroes? I think I know who your sporting hero was. Am I imagining this, or have you told me about Gordon Greenwich?
Yeah, absolutely, Gordon Greenwich. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, most of my generation would have sort of chosen Viv Richards. I mean, because I guess he was the most iconic player. But I think maybe it's the, I guess, sort of strict nonconformist in me. There's something about the sort of correct way in which Greenwich played that I just loved. And he was very self-effacing. So whereas Richard was a lot of sort of swaggering arrogance, and brilliant at that, I think there was something very understated and modest actually about Gordon Greenwich. And so I kind of identify with him because he was never the most popular player, but yet he was someone who was a fantastic team player. And I think there was something about a kind of anchoring that he did. So what I always saw in him as a kind of salvific figure, I think, is that within, I guess, sort of Black Christianity, we've often seen Jesus as being that dependable person who is just there. So it doesn't matter how much chaos is going on around the world, like, that Jesus is this rock solid center who's just very stable and is trustworthy and will deliver. And really, Gordon Greenwich really was just all of that. So like there was just something very, very understated about him. So like there's that wonderful moment, I think, in Henley. I mean, it is probably still my happiest day of sport ever, which was the 1984 tour where the West Indies scored 359 runs in one day to win the Test match, and Gordon Greenwich scored 214 not out. And there's one bit where he gets a double hundred, and a number of fans just pile onto the pitch like to come and shake his hand. And he's so embarrassed. It's like, okay, guys, just kind of, okay, like, get back, I mean, let's not make a fuss. Let's just go and sit down. Let's just keep it calm. And I was in tears. I thought, well, in that moment where he could just be exuberant, he was just very self-contained. I mean, it's probably as much about my own personality. He's just a very self-contained person who didn't show his emotions a great deal, but yet underneath that was just this rock iron will, I think, to want to sort of succeed. And I think for many years he was my hero. Now, one of the best moments, which, like you may have heard me share the story before, was I was in Barbados 3 years ago, and I was doing some lecturing, and I had an afternoon off. And my friend, who was my host, says in passing, oh, Anthony, by the way, do you know that a number of the Bayesian cricketing greats, like, they meet at a bar? would you like to go? Well, it's like, okay, get in the car, take me there right now. And they often say, don't meet your heroes because they will let you down. Absolutely not. I met God in Greenwich, and 5 hours disappeared like it was like 2 minutes. And he was everything I hoped he would be, and even more so. So when he spoke about playing the game, he said, I was always aware that particularly when we played in England, I was playing not just for myself, not just for the team, but I was playing for every Caribbean migrant who was in a crappy job that they hated. And my job was to make them feel better for just a few moments. And so I was always concerned that I wasn't playing for myself, unlike Viv, where he could sort of give his wicket away. Greenwich never did. And so that was amongst the happiest 5 hours of my whole life. I mean, it just skipped so quickly, to the point whereby when my host said, okay, and we have to go now because you've got a Bible study to lead in a local church and the local will have turned up to meet you. And never has a man turned up at a Bible study in such bad humor and ill grace as myself, because I want to stay in the bar, quite frankly, all night. So when I left Gordon Greenwich and he said, and I shook his hand, and literally, my friend had to prise my hands off his hands because I did not want to leave him. Yeah, pretty ridiculous really for an adult to acknowledge such hero worship and such love. But yeah, I mean, those were like 5 of the happiest hours of my life.
So you've talked a bit about your recollections of and appreciation of sport and how it connects to religion and so on. How important is being a Black person of African descent to this?
Actually, yeah, I mean, it's become really quite key. I mean, I wasn't aware of it. I know exactly when I became aware of it, and some people may remember the particular moment. So in the 1976 tour, so that was like the first real moment I really was old enough like to appreciate not just the game itself, but all the politics and the, I guess, sort of colonial and post-colonial sort of nuances of that. So West Indies toured England in 1976, and part of the series starting, the English captain was called Tony Greig, who was a white South African. And he was given an interview, and he was saying how in his estimation, that the West Indies were very talented players, but they couldn't take pressure, and they could not stand, I guess, that to be put under extreme pressure. And so what he was going to do, he said that when they were up, they were jolly, fantastic players. I mean, all kind of racial stereotypes going there. But however, when they were down, they would grovel. And his aim was to make this team grovel. And two things struck me actually, as I actually sat with my dad watching the interview, was firstly, like the food literally spat out of his mouth as he heard Tony Greig saying this. And my dad was incandescent with rage and said, something, actually, we got to beat these bastards. And I'd never seen this passion actually in my dad before. And actually, when I watched that test series that summer, what was interesting was that although at that point I never set foot in the Caribbean, that Jamaica was just an island I heard my parents talk about in very mythological terms, but I was English. Yorkshire accent I still have, probably just a lot stronger than it would be now, and had probably never set foot outside of England, so I'm English. But it never occurred to me that I would support the English team. Never occurred to me that I would support a team full of white people versus a touring team full of people of African and Asian descent in a part of the world I never set foot in. And that, I think, became, for me, quite a significant political attitude, because I think into this day, I don't support England or Britain at any sport. I mean, basically, it's anyone versus England. So even at the moment, actually, in rugby union, you'll be pleased to know that my favourite team was always a Welsh team. So it was Wales first, Scotland second, Ireland third, France fourth, England fifth.
You're failing the Tebbit test in spectacular style, Anthony. Do people know about the Tebbit test?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And so explain that the Tebbit test for those who don't know. So a number of years ago, this when Norman Tebbit, I think, was, can't remember what cabinet position he held. But anyway, so like he was being interviewed.
Thatcher's government, yeah.
In Thatcher's government in the early 80s. And he's been interviewed on television. And he was sort of saying that like the problems with the immigrant communities, this probably would have been soon after the riots of 1981. Of which Headingley was one of the places, not Headingley, sorry, Chapeltown in Leeds was one of the places that kind of went up in flames, not so much in Bradford, but more in Leeds. And basically was like saying that the problem with these immigrant communities is that like we were not integrating enough. And part of the problem, he said, is that they were too attached to the cultures and the communities of their parents and not enough in terms of showing allegiance to Britain where they were born. And he said, and a classic example, he said, is that when I watch cricket, I see young black children and young Asian children supporting the West Indies and Pakistan and India, and they're not supporting England. And basically he says, his Tebbit test was, he says, if these people want to be properly British, they have to support Britain and not the countries of their parents' birth. And I remember just delighting, probably not helped by the fact that, as I said, like I'm named after Tony Benn anyway, so therefore I wasn't inclined to believe anything a Tory minister said. But I was absolutely delighted that I would fail the Tebbit test every single time. I think what I'm aware of is that this is very much a generational thing. So again, another quick anecdote. So my younger brother, Richard, he's 3 years younger than me. And my nephew, his only child's called Noah. And there was a big existential crisis in our family about 10 years ago. Like Noah's 18 now. But at the time he was about 7 or 8. And he went to his dad and said, Dad, I want an England football shirt. And Richard is as rapidly post-colonial as I am anyway. So he rings me up in a state of great agitation and says, Anthony, I've got this crisis. I don't know what to do. So I'm thinking, my God, you know, who's died? What's happening here? And he says, no. He says, but it's serious. Noah wants an England football shirt, but I can't buy him a shirt. How can I buy him an England shirt? And at this point, I'm sort of trying to be partly, I guess, like responsible older brother, uncle, and saying, well, you know, like we can't impose our prejudices upon a younger generation. Like you've got to let him find his own way. At which point Richard said, yeah, but if it was your son, would you buy him an English shirt? And I said, well, yeah, I'm not sure about that either, to be honest with you. So in the end, my brother bought him a Brazilian shirt. All that to say that I think one of the things I'm very clear about in terms of my own politics, that it is very much of its era. It's a 1970s, 80s identity politics that really actually a younger generation don't hold to. So Noah supports England and can't see why his uncle and his father are so anti-English and so anti-British when we are born here and we've got British passports. He generally can't get it. And that's why I sort of try to say Noah, it's a generational thing, you know. I mean, so like you didn't grow up actually with the politics we grew up in. So, you know, so like we agree to differ. So when England play, he's supporting England. His dad and I are supporting anyone but England. So yeah, so for me, I think it's tied up with my politics. It's probably helped to explain why I'm into Black liberation theology. Yeah. And so for you, Rob, so how important is being Welsh in your understanding and appreciation of sports and its possible connection to religion?
Well, as I've said already, I think I feel very Welsh, although I've not lived in Wales for more than 40 years. I don't sound Welsh generally. Sue says I do when I get very excited. We had a holiday in West Wales a couple of years ago, and our host had a lovely, strong, Llanelli West Wales accent, and I found myself in conversation with him, taking on the old Welsh accent that I'd once had after a fashion. And Sue said to me at one point, "You must be careful. He'll think you're mocking him." I said, "I can't help it. It's just coming back as I've listened to him talk." So yes, I feel very most Welsh. I feel when I'm watching Wales play rugby, and to some extent when although I don't get the chance to watch Glamorgan play cricket in the same way, but to some extent that. If I can do, I'll watch Welsh provincial rugby on the television. Sometimes I'll watch it through my Skybox on S4C with a Welsh language commentary. You know, one just bears with this because it enables me to watch the game. And a bit like you, I'm ashamed to say that when it comes to rugby, at least, it's slightly different with other sports. But when it comes to rugby, I always want England to lose. And my children generally support Wales, though there's one exception which I'll talk about in a minute. But they can't understand why England aren't my second team, if you see what I mean. Whereas in fact they're my last team. So you know, I'm watching France play England. Oh, go on, allez la France. Even come on, New Zealand. It's something I don't fully understand. And hearing you talk about it, Anthony, I think I do understand something of what is driving you with me. I think it's much more complicated. And I've been thinking a little bit about this. So when I was at school and we learned Welsh history, it was compulsory to do that if you were taking history courses. I think the narrative that we received then was, it would be too strong to say it was anti-English, but it certainly made us aware of the key pinch points in Welsh history when people far away from us had made decisions that affected us in negative ways, which killed off the Welsh language, for instance, which, as I say, I never spoke in anything other than a very, very basic way. And yet somehow I wanted to be able to speak it. And of course, as I was growing up, the devolution debate was very much alive in Wales. And in Wales now, there's nothing like the same movement for independence that there is in Scotland. If there was a referendum on independence in Wales now, it would be lost by a large margin. And yet there's still a very strong sense of Welshness over against. And when we have a particular identity, we construct that to a greater or lesser extent, don't we, over against something else. That's part of what we're doing. And it's often over against those who are closest to us, actually. So your Manchester City, Manchester United story is perhaps pertinent here. It's Liverpool, Everton, it's Celtic and Rangers. We lived in Bristol for 14 years. It's Bristol City and Bristol Rovers on a kind of lower, less intensive scale. And it's Wales and England. And England probably can't tell an historical narrative which casts Wales as villains, but Wales can tell an historical narrative that puts England as villains. And that narrative somehow emerges for me in rugby. That's where I feel Welsh. That's where I identify with a story. And being part of a religious community in some ways is identifying with a story. It's making that story our story. It's somehow living it, passing it on to the next generation, which is, so three of my 4 children are very strong Welsh supporters. It's not just the fact that I'm Welsh, of course, both their grandparents were Welsh, actually. My eldest son is an England rugby supporter. I still speak to him. Shall I tell you, it all went wrong when he went to university in Wales. And going to university in Wales as somebody born in England, what he experienced was something very close to a discrimination that looked and felt a bit like racism. Yeah. And he came away with Wales as his bottom team. Yeah. So it really turned him against it. Now, where's the connection with religion? Well, I've already spoken a bit about the way in which religion and sport kind of get overlaid upon one another in certain respects in Welsh rugby. Of course, sport sometimes traces its origins back to religious rites. Deep in the mists of times, sports clubs often come out of religious contexts, much more near history. And I think there's a kind of civil religion function in sport that articulates through its rituals and symbols and ceremonies something about these shared stories that we believe in, that we take to ourselves. And I guess it's somewhere around there. But until I knew you were going to ask me that question a few days ago, Anthony, I hadn't really thought about it in quite that way. So I'm grateful for that. So we talked a bit about ethnicity and religion. What about class? That's kind of lurking in the background of some of these things. You've been brought up in West Yorkshire, dissenting nonconformist Christian home. What part does class play in your understanding of all this?
Yeah. I mean, it's huge. It's huge, and in some respects, it's become more significant the longer I've been away from Bradford. So, like yourself, I spent more time living outside of Yorkshire than I did within it. But I think there's something about being in exile. And I often joke that, you know, like there's these sort of professional Yorkshiremen who love Yorkshire so much that's why we don't live there, you know. So like Michael Parkinson and Jeff Boycott and all the other people who will tell you how wonderful it is, but like they've spent most of their life actually sort of living in the south.
They say, Anthony, that there are 2.5 million people in Wales and 20 million outside Wales singing about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me, I think the hardest thing to deconstruct, and I spent a lot of time, particularly as a practical theologian, actually looked a lot around lived religious experience and theological reflection on different aspects of my identity. And the hardest bit to deconstruct, and I think maybe it's because I don't really want to, are some of the very primal, I guess, prejudices I grew up with, actually sort of growing up in West Yorkshire. So we were sort of chapel Christianity. And so we knew clearly who our enemies were, and our enemies were the Church of England, and they were part of the establishment and the ruling class. And of course, all of this, of course, was entirely mythologized, you know. And so part of the tropes about the church I went to was you were identified as much by the things that you were not as you were in terms of the things that were very much as a part and parcel of your identity in terms of your allegiance and your affiliation. So one of the things I remember was that the church I grew up in was a large city centre mission. So this was the attempt of Methodism to try and rival the Church of England by building our own cathedral. So it's a large city centre, massive building on 5 floors. And we were parallel to in the city, like we were parallel to Bradford Cathedral. And I'm ashamed to say that in the 19 years I was in Bradford before I left home to go to Birmingham University, I never set foot in the cathedral once. There were always attempts by the dean of the cathedral to invite people from our church to go over to them, particularly in terms of being neighbours and being ecumenical. So in fairness, like the Anglicans were much more gracious than the Methodists were ever in the other way around. And we never went. We just refused to go. It's like, well, basically, this is going on to foreign territory. It was probably easier to go into a mosque, and talk to Muslims than it was like to go into a cathedral and talk to Anglicans. And I carried this for a long time. And the moment I was reminded of how you can, at its worst, imbibe forms of prejudice and particular worldview without ever deconstructing that. So when I was working at an ecumenical college, theological college in Birmingham called Queen's, and there was an occasion where the Bishop of Birmingham, who was always the chair of the governors, was coming. And it was agreed that we would have a traditional service based on the Book of Common Prayer. The rubric was that when the gospel was read, like we would stand for the gospel anyway. So at this point, I'm a super non-conformist chapel Methodist, even though I've been away from it for a long time. And basically, in our tradition, you didn't stand for the gospel because all of it is equally inspired. And quite frankly, I didn't like to be told actually what I should do. So I decided that I'm not going to stand for the gospel. So I sat right at the front, right in front of the bishop. And when they said, we now stand for the gospel, I sat down militantly with my arms folded and thought, sod you, I'm not standing. So everyone else is standing in the chapel, I'm not standing. They're all staring at me and I don't care because I'm a rugged, nonconformist, Labour Party supporting, low church. I was about to say evangelical Methodist. I probably stopped being evangelical a long time before then. But anyway, I'm not standing. I refuse to stand. Afterwards now, when we're having sort of coffee and we're doing a sort of polite chit chat, like the Archdeacon comes up to me, who kind of sort of knew me quite well. And said, Anthony, he says, I've always been amused by you Methodists, which of course like it's fighting talk now. And I'm thinking, okay, you know. So give it your best shot and I will give you a volley of abuse in reply. He says, it's just this. So you won't stand for the gospel, but you will stand for the collection. And I was just pulled up short. I thought, oh, okay. Yeah, if you put it like that, it is a bit ridiculous. It has to be said. But up to that point, I had never given any thought about all the things I'd imbibed that were myths, because all the divides between our two churches were generations before anyone actually was in this particular church. And certainly for someone born in 1964, it had very little to do with my formation, except for, as I said, that bounded sense of knowing who your enemies were and knowing what you are not, that almost becomes as powerful a shaper as the things that you are. So in your case, Rob, so I know that rugby union is a middle-class sport in most parts of Britain, but not in Wales. So I'm curious, as someone who's brought up in the Baptist tradition in Wales, is it a stretch to say that there's a connection between sort of chapel Christianity and Welsh rugby union?
Well, I think that the hymn singing at rugby internationals might suggest that there is. These were the hymns of the chapels that were being sung. And I think this is a really interesting question, though I think there's also a danger of romanticism. While in England, rugby or rugger was often seen as, and still is often seen as, a middle-class game, I think in Wales it certainly is played by working people, but it has been governed by the middle class or other social elites, as most sports have been, of course. Incidentally, I think the same is true as rugby league. Some of you will know that rugby league split off from rugby union in the 1890s because the clubs in the north wanted to pay players. And it's often cast as a kind of social control question of which social groups are going to control the game. But the narrative that rugby league tells itself is of how that once they split off, they were able to create a game more expressive of their working class identity. What the narrative that most sociologists tell is that once it splits off from rugby union, the middle class who were in control of it could shape a game for working class men so that they could control them more easily. So, one takes this with a pinch of salt, really. But back to Wales, I think the position in rugby and sport generally perhaps is mirrored in the churches. Control is held by those who had economic and political power and social status. But on the field, things were mixed. But in terms of governance, sport is too important to be left to the masses. And that's true in all sports. All sports have really, until very recently, for the most part, cricket, football, everything, basically being governed by amateurs. So even when the amateur myth has lost out on the field and everybody's paid, in the boardrooms it still rules. And so in terms of playing rugby in Wales, relatively classless. And of course, cricket is also an intriguing study in class relationships, in that the Lord of the Manor and the Gardener would often play in the same team together, but you could pretty much guarantee that the Lord of the Manor would be the opening batsman and the Gardener would be the opening bowler. So there's all kinds of ways in which social stereotypes were reinforced, and theological perspectives have quite a lot to say about all of this, I think. But I'm often struck by the ways in which sports organizations resemble churches. Who's in control? Who dictates the narrative, and so on. our time is going.
Yeah.
You're on record as saying you don't support Britain in any sporting activity. You've said that already. Can you say a little more about that? To what extent is that related to your identity as post-colonial, a word you've used a number of times?
Yeah, basically, yeah. I mean, I've sort of to answer that before, really. Yeah, I mean, I think long before it became fashionable to talk about post-colonial discourse, I think there was a generation of it's not myself, I think the whole generation was born approximately probably early mid-60s through to mid to late 70s who would have held that particular view. So we, you know, is that sense of being oppositional. So if you've been brought up with narratives that tell you that you don't belong, then like you do one of two things, like you either desperately try to belong or you accentuate that sense of not belonging. And so I had relatives who were perhaps even more radical than I was, in that they became Rasta. And that was very much the visible part of dissent. Now, I wasn't as radical as that. I mean, I had a very strong Christian home and I was probably scared of my dad. So I wasn't going to become a Rasta anytime soon. But however, I did share that sense of not belonging and not identifying. I think it's always complicated because I remember the first time I went to Jamaica when I was 16 in 1980 and hated it. I was there for 6 weeks and never did I feel more English than when I was in the village where my parents came from. And although in one sense I looked like I belonged, I was black, everybody knew I was English. So actually, like the running joke was, I would walk down the road very quickly because I'm English, so I would walk with purpose, even though quite frankly, when it's like 90 degrees, like you don't walk with purpose because, you know, it's hot. So, you know, and people would look at me and go, Englishman. And I'm like, but how can you tell? But looking back, it was obvious. I stuck out like a sore thumb. And I think there's always been that sense of liminality ever since, really. That sense of, is there any place I really belong in an absolute sense? And it's probably not, but actually it probably makes for writing very well, because I think there's something about not quite belonging that gives you a vantage point that is different from the people who do. So I think that's probably helped, you know, I mean, a lot of the writing as a post-colonial scholar. It used to bother me, now I kind of revel in it. So in your sense then, very quickly, as we close, Rob, as a Welsh-born person, as you said, who's lived most of your life in England, I mean, how do you see the intersections and between Welshness and Britishness?
I've been pondering intersectionality since last week, actually, when our speaker majored on it. And sport is an interesting site for uncovering multiple and overlapping identities, I think. Yes, I've been musing about this. I feel, as you'll have gathered, I feel Welsh, very British, but not English. I'm white. I'm the son of ordinary working people, is what I jotted down. But my dad wouldn't have described himself as working class, though he was. But he wouldn't have described himself in that way because he was a police constable and he voted Tory. So he'd have found another way of putting it. My mum and dad both got their pay in a little crinkly envelope at the end of the week in cash. When I was little, I remember that. First generation of my family at university, that wasn't that uncommon at the time that I went to university. I'm an ordained person, male, husband, brother, father, son, Baptist, Christian, politically left of centre. I support Wales, Cardiff Blues, Glamorgan, Bristol Bears as rugby, Bristol City, not Rovers, Arsenal. Some of these identities I've chosen. Some of them, I think I would have to say, have chosen me. And some of them, of course, if they're not in conflict with one another, are uncomfortable alongside one another. So one of the famous examples from the sporting world, of course, is the Chariots of Fire hero, Eric Liddell, who found that his athletic and Christian identity wouldn't go together. We may have fewer qualms about Sabbath sport, but if you want to play sport seriously and or socialize with sporting colleagues, the chances are that at some point your Christian identity and maybe others are going to be stretched and challenged and so on. And I think maybe we have similar issues with these overlapping identities in church life sometimes. Now, I read Galatians 3 to say that our identities are not abolished in Christ, though they might in some way be subordinated to our identity in Christ. That some of our identities are more fundamental than others, but that somehow our identity as Christian people is fundamental to all of them, even more fundamental than my Welshness. So when I acknowledge Galatians 3:28 and Ephesians 2 about the enmity being abolished between us, I really think I ought to be a bit more charitable to the English rugby team, but I'm working on it. Now, as I thought about these, I began to think that none of these identities seriously impacted me in a negative way. But I think there have been moments, actually, when being Baptist or even being Welsh, certainly the social status inherited as the son of working class parents from South Wales may have counted against me and have not given me the privileges that I've sometimes seen others enjoy. And I might never have noticed that some of these identities have given me privileges which others don't enjoy. And maybe if I'd not come back to work in Oxford, I wouldn't have seen most of this, partly because in Oxford I've gained something of a more theoretical understanding of it, but also because actually in the university, one can experience the dislocations that come from these competing identities and these social groups that rub up against one another. Some of you know I'm reading at the moment the Diary of an MP's Wife by Sasha Swire, which is an uproariously good read if any of you are interested in this kind of thing. But if ever you wanted to nurture a grievance against the ruling classes, you could do it quite easily from reading this book and know yourself to be, in most of our cases, on the outside of it. So one feels this sense of where privilege is and where it isn't here, I think. So I've rambled a bit in response to that, Anthony, and bearing in mind what the time is, I'm just going to stop. Rather than finish, I'm stopping.
Yeah. And I will stop there as well. So thank you very much, Rob, for certainly for myself. I mean, I feel that I know you a lot better now, and it's been really good, like, to amplify some of the very fleeting conversations that we've had before, and I look forward, like, to many more as this year progresses. But now, as is customary the case, we'll kind of throw it over